Our moderator for the forum tonight is Dr. Sarah Roy. She's a senior research scholar at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. She's trained as a political economist and has worked in the Gaza Strip and West Bank since 1985, conducting research primarily on the economic, social, and political development of the Gaza Strip and on U.S. foreign aid to the region.
Welcome to the Cambridge Forum, discussing prospects for a two-state solution in the Middle East with Husam Zomlot, currently a research fellow at Harvard University. I'm Sarah Roy, a senior research scholar at Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies. When the Oslo Peace Accord was signed in 1993, the prospects for a Palestinian state and for Palestinian state building in the West Bank and Gaza seemed bright and a hoped-for outcome of the Oslo process. Today, nearly 2 decades later, the prospects for state building, let alone peace, are far dimmer. What has happened in the interim period, and can the deadlock in peace building be broken and a process of meaningful redress be initiated? These are some of the questions that our speaker, Dr. Zomlot, will discuss as we examine the likelihood of a two-state solution in the Middle East. Dr. Husam Zomlot is a research fellow in the Dubai Initiative at the Belfer Center for International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. A specialist in the political economy of conflict, he holds a PhD in economics from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. His research interest is in the area of war to peace transitions and conflict transformation, looking particularly at the process of state formation, governance and capacity building, private sector development, and the role of international assistance. He has authored a number of articles, book chapters, and working papers. His most recent paper is entitled The Politics of International Post-Conflict Interventions, Palestine Between Peace Building, State Building, and Back to Reconstruction. Husam served as first counselor to the Palestinian diplomatic mission to the UK from 2003 to 2008. As a diplomat and scholar, he represented Palestine in various bilateral and multilateral forums, tracked 2 negotiations, and was regularly interviewed by mainstream British and international media. He also worked for the United Nations Office of the Special Coordinator in the Occupied Territories from 1996 to 1999. So it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Zomlot.
I'm particularly keen on and inspired by the fact that tonight's event is part of the forum series on the challenges facing the Obama administration. And indeed, I am very inspired by this particular topic, the Obama administration. And before I start tackling my topic, the prospects for a two-state solution in the Middle East, I'd like to share with you an experience of mine in the evening of the 4th of November, 2008. And that was the evening of the US elections. A friend had invited me to watch the election results with tens of Harvard students and associates in his living room. As we gathered in excitement, the moment when results were announced by the anchor, the CNN anchor for that matter, that moment, I believe, will live with me and in me for the rest of my life. In that packed room of young people from all walks of life, from all colors, creed, faith, continents, name it, the packed room of young people sat on their nerves, including myself, for long hours. And once we heard the announcement, and while largely anticipated, it sent shockwaves among the group. You may expect that the room was full of laughter, shouts, noise, hugging, and celebrating. That came after a long pause of silence as the tears in the eyes of each and every one of us were louder and more expressive than all the words of the many languages spoken by the diverse group. It was a language that we all understood, a rare but intense moment as we transcended beyond boundaries, beyond color, beyond creed, beyond religion, beyond politics, beyond class. It was a moment when we spoke one universal language. It was a moment when we let loose of our fears, our wounds, and our doubts. It was a moment when hope took over desperation, and when our commonalities overwhelmed our differences, and when our shared dream for a united human family against tyranny, racism, absolutism, and injustice was unleashed again. Simply put, it was a human moment. And regardless of what Obama has or has not achieved at the political level, his winning was a victory for an entire generation, a victory for Martin Luther King, a victory for the founding fathers of the United States of America, a victory for the liberal and free America, a victory for the masses. And it was a defeat for all those who saw in our grievances and differences an opportunity to exploit, and a defeat for all those who believed and made us believe that the power of the people is a Greek myth. Why have I spent the precious few minutes talking about that moment when I should be talking about Palestine? Because Palestine is right at the core of all this. More than a century of sheer and endless human suffering, decades of dispossession and displacement, of the denial of identity, of heritage, of legitimate aspirations for freedom and dignity, and of the denial for the quest of a better future, have had its toll, not only on Palestinians and Israelis, but on the human family at large. As the last remaining unfinished business of the 19th and the 20th century, the Palestine question has become the global moral divide. The divide between might and right, between people and armies, between masses and organized groups, between courage and cowardice, between decency and decadence, between universal values and military rules, between determination and surrender, and between hope and despair. I belong to the hopeful camp, and here is why. I see no future, and I see no alternative but for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, for Palestinians and Israelis, to find a way, not to carve that land, but to share it. Not to build walls, but to build mixed neighborhoods. Not to find a way, or to find a way to live on and love that small and cherished piece of land, the size of New Jersey, for those who don't know. And to reach that almost inevitable outcome, and I firmly believe it is an inevitable outcome, there are two ways to do it. There is what I would call the shortcut, and there is the long route or route to that destination. The shortcut, in my opinion, is the two-state solution. And it is for that reason that I am a very strong supporter of this formula. For in the two-state solution is the idea of disengagement between two communities, two nations that have had several wounds. In that disengagement, there will be created an opportunity for them to re-engage again at one stage, re-engage to find a common destiny, re-engage when they have managed to go through the fascinating journey of self-searching, of nation building, and of state building. And that shortcut that I firmly believe should be our main focus is unfortunately under huge strain as we speak. I'll rather be more pessimistic and say, after 17 years of repeated relentless attempts at realizing that final destination, the two-state solution, or that outcome, I can say that we are no more closer to the two-state solution than we were just at the turn of the 90s when the Oslo Accord happened. In fact, in comparison to the early 90s, when peace was just around the corner, things are way worse. I'll just go back to the two-state solution formula. And I'll claim today that that formula was a Palestinian-initiated formula. On the 15th of November 1988, in Algiers, the Palestine National Council convened. It convened to approve a plan and to listen to the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat announcing and pronouncing an independent Palestine. In that plan, the Palestinian National Council, or the Palestine National Council, approved a Palestinian independent state on the 1967 borders, that is the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, its capital, effectively calling for a two-state solution, one Palestinian on 22% of the land, and one Israel on the pre-1967 borders. That unleashed what is now espoused by almost every leader in the world. That unleashed the two-state solution. Few years later, 1993, the Oslo Accords were signed. During these years, where I was myself living in Gaza and the West Bank, and I was working with the United Nations, in fact, as I was telling Peter earlier, and my task was primarily to monitor the peace process. It was indeed clear that while there was good and enough goodwill in the part of the main players, things on the ground were going exactly the opposite direction. Between 1997 and the year 2000, up until September 2000, things were really flourishing because the previous 2 years witnessed violence, witnessed some suicide bombings, witnessed the assassination of Rabin, witnessed several upheaval for the peace process. But from 1997, that was a year when things became a bit calmer at the operation level, until 2000. The Israeli economy grew at a historical high rates. Israel opened diplomatic ties with countries it has never dreamed of. So did the Palestinian economy, by the way. Between 1997 and 2000, the economic growth was above 8%. During these very same years, there was no one Israeli killed inside Israel. There were incidents inside the occupied territories, but inside Israel proper, there was the least level of violence in decades. Yet, in these very same years, Israel's settlements doubled. Exactly doubled. That enterprise, which was unleashed just after the 1967 war, has become so monstrous to an extent that nobody is able to stop it. There are three possible alternatives to a two-state solution, all of which involve the creation of a greater Israel, an Israel that effectively controls the entire of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. In my opinion, this scenario already exists. The three alternatives is, number one, the creation of a democratic binational state, a state of all its citizens. As you all know, this will mark the end of Zionism, and therefore has been and will continue being resisted by the mainstream Zionists. The second possible scenario for the two states, or an alternative for the two-state solution, is a mass expulsion that will ensure the Jewish majority in the historic Palestine, as happened in 1948. I will not go into details of this scenario, while I do firmly believe that there are several attempts in East Jerusalem as we speak in Sheikh Jarrah. There was an Israeli military rule number 1605 that was revealed by the Israeli journalist Amira Hass that gives any Israeli military officer the ability to arrest, imprison, and actually deport any Palestinian who do not carry an Israeli ID, an Israeli permit for that matter. There are attempts, but as far as I'm concerned, I do not believe that this is a viable scenario, for there is no stomach for such an act within the international community nor in the region. The third and last scenario is what is taking place as we speak. It is the de facto, it is the evolving status quo in the land from Jordan, the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. That is a one state, Israel, controlling disconnected enclaves of Palestinians, and increasingly evolving into a full-fledged apartheid state. It seems to me, at least, that the two-state solution is the best of all these alternatives. And I'm here, by the way, paraphrasing Professor John Mearsheimer of Chicago University, who said that this is not an ideal solution, the two-state, because it is not, but it is by far the best outcome for the Israelis, Palestinians, as well as the United States. And by the way, this is exactly why the Obama administration is intensely committed to pushing the two-state formula. There are so many reasons why the two-state solution might no longer be really attainable, one of which is the 500,000 settlers in the occupied territories. Those people are not going just to submit easily. You have implanted them over decades. You have given them all the favoritism you can give. They are, and according even to polls, are going to put up a fierce fight. You have built for them roads for Jews only, schools for Jews only, and settlers only. You have empowered them by the protection of the biggest army in the region, etc., etc. Removing them is not going to be a piece of cake. Another very depressing factor is that while settlements were mushrooming when there was still something called Israeli left during the early 90s, Labour Party, Meretz, etc., now Israel has tilted towards the right, big time. It has tilted towards the right to an extent, and here I do not relieve Palestinians of their responsibility of pushing Israel in some, and in particular, moments towards, or contributing to that at least. But a moment when Israel's foreign face is Avigdor Lieberman, its foreign minister is Lieberman, is not a moment when we believe or when we think that there is a coalition of leftist Israelis or those who are pro-peace. And there is the ideological obstacle, the ideological barrier. And you know that there is a considerable constituency in Israel. And I'm not going to say majority because I do not have the numbers, but I believe they are within the majority, who believe that Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is a God-given land. And any compromise or concession here or there would be even against the will of God. And it is really for all these reasons extremely difficult to imagine any Israeli government, let alone Netanyahu's, to garner and gather the political will to actually produce the two-state solution as you and I know it. And this is exactly why the advocates and propagators of the two-state solution believe that there is only one way to do this. That is Allah via President Obama. That the only hope for the realization in the 11th hour of a two-state solution is through an American president who is committed, who knows that this is to the best strategic interest of America, who would put the full force and the full weight of the United States of America behind this solution. I believe that President Obama is up for the job. I know for a fact, as somebody who has read conflict resolution and who has been following the Palestine cause, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict for several years, what we would have hoped from any American president is three things. First is an early-on commitment to resolve the conflict, not to wait like George W. Bush until the last hour. Second is to appoint somebody who's credible, with clouts, who knows how to resolve conflicts, and who does not come from any camp, unbiased, fair. And thirdly, a president will offer early on a parameters, a guideline for how to resolve the conflict. President Obama did the first two in the first day, and he is currently, as we speak, working on the third, that is the producing of a blueprint for the resolution of the conflict. In theory, he could not be better. However, as you may have heard, and I'm sure all of you have been following, he has failed in the first test, not for the lack of an intention, nor for the lack of a belief, but for the lack of an ability to press ahead. He has discovered the many obstacles, locally and globally, when it comes to Israel, and when it comes to the conflict in general. I will not repeat, because I see so many experts in this room, people who have actually taught me, like Herb Kellman, who all of you know what happened in the last year. So I will not really go into details given the time. And I know I might have only 1 or 2 minutes to conclude. But there are so many complicated issues that has to do with the US landscape, political landscape. And the lobby, the pro-Israel lobby, the Apex, is one of them. It's not the whole story. There is the Christian Zionists who firmly believe that the two-state solution would bring an end to the Christian faith altogether. That Eretz Israel is a divine intervention. That the creation of the state of Israel on the greater Israel is almost the second coming of the Messiah. How do you talk to these people? How do you convince them? What is the starting point for a 70+ million block of voters who are, as we speak today, I heard their representative, Lincoln, was it his name? I forgot, from DC, warning President Obama that they will go one block against him in 2012. I will not go into details of this. It will come in of other. But there is also a third major obstacle, not only an Israeli and not only an American. There is a Palestinian obstacle. Palestinians are divided, not only politically, but geographically. And this is not a moment when they are capable of at least pushing for the two-state solution, let alone realizing it. This is one of the weakest moments of their history. If the situation, and here I would want to end, I had prepared longer, but I didn't know that I would brag on at the beginning and take all this time. But if the situation evolves into a full-fledged apartheid, I'll tell you this. I just arrived back from Ramallah, literally 3 days ago. And I may share with you my main sort of conclusions out of that trip. The first is Palestinians are increasingly aware that they are moving towards a South African style anti-apartheid movement. And I sensed, not at the official level, but at the grassroots level, at the NGO level, the ringleaders of the various political factions, I sensed a sort of positioning. In fact, the most delegations I met in Ramallah, or I was aware of their presence, were delegations from the ANC of South Africa. They were visiting Ramallah by the tens, and they were invited by their Palestinian counterparts to give them training courses, to usher them, to explain to them how can Palestinians embrace a South African-style anti-apartheid movement. Number two, I came back from Ramallah or from Palestine recently, believing that Palestinians are about to embrace a non-violent resistance against Israel. And this is a huge development. In my opinion, this could be one of the most important developments in recent history. Because as you are aware, for the last few years, violence has tainted the conflict, and it has had its toll on Palestinians before any other. Palestinians have realized that the only way forward for them is not the military scores, nor the economic pressure, but the attainment of the moral high grounds. They have learned that the hard way, through destruction, through murder, through imprisonment of half of their adulthood generation. And I, for one, believe that this is the biggest and the strongest weapon Palestinians have, non-violence. And we see it every day, and you are reading about it every day. It is a mushrooming phenomenon in Bil'ain, in Na'lin, everywhere in the West Bank. We went to Bil'ain just before I left with a group of political representatives from the various political factions, and I was surprised happily that the Hamas representative in the group said that Hamas fully supports non-violent resistance. Now this is a transformation. I do not think that the man stood there saying that only because he passionately believes that and there was a transformation. But he and his party, his faction, his movement has started to feel the heat, the popular heat and the popular demand for non-violence. And finally, Palestinians are aware that for them to achieve the end of oppression and occupation, they must unite not only among themselves. And by the way, I've really seen a lot of movements inside Palestine at the party level, at the popular level, towards internal Palestinian healing, unity. Things are not very ripe yet, but I left Palestine for the first time in 2-3 years feeling that we are closer to that realization. Not only they need partners among themselves, but also with the people of the world, and form an international solidarity movement. I think now Palestinians have finally made the shift, and here I end, from revolutionary legitimacy to international legitimacy. And in that, I invite you to give them a hand, to give them a support, and to walk that long walk of freedom of theirs like that of South Africa. Thank you.
Husam, I shall begin by asking you the first question. Salam Fayyad argues that state building should not be tied to or conditioned upon a political breakthrough with Israel. Hence, Palestinians should not wait for a political process to realize their state, but instead should start building it now, making the reality of a Palestinian state impossible to ignore. This is quite a controversial argument, as you know. So my question is this: can good governance end the occupation, as Fayyad advocates? That is, can a meaningful state emerge under current conditions, and what kind of state can it be?
I wouldn't want to start with that question, Sarah. That is a very difficult question, I have to say, but it links beautifully with the last phrase I said, that Palestinians are about to, or they are going through the shift from revolutionary legitimacy to international legitimacy. And why I'm re-mentioning that? If Salam Fayyad is understood, before I go into that, his idea are simply put, is that we Palestinians, he says, shouldn't wait for a political process to yield a two-state solution or a Palestinian state, nor should we wait for negotiations to be cultivated in the outcome of a two-state solution. We should build our state, regardless. And when the moment comes, we will present it as fait accompli. Now, if Salam Fayyad is understood as a sole act, and through the building of institutions, the bringing about of good governance as in transparency, effectiveness, etc., would on itself and on its own end occupation, then that will not do justice neither to him nor to the idea. I do not believe on its own state building can deliver statehood. The occupation, the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian land is not due to the lack of institutions. If it was, I would be happy to celebrate building more institutions. In fact, Palestinians have built institutions in the 90s that were hailed by serious institutions like the World Bank, IMF, the Foreign on Council relations. And all these institutions by the year 2000, 2001 were literally destroyed in the first Israeli invasion. But why I do support Salam Fayyad? Because I believe Salam Fayyad is not just about building institutions. I believe Salam Fayyad is part and parcel of what I was just telling you, of a Palestinian quest for international legitimacy. He is a pillar of their new campaign to reach out for the international community. Israel, for the last several years, have been using three main excuses, pretexts, in justification of why it has been blocking the creation of a Palestinian state. The first pretext is that on security grounds, that if they concede a Palestinian state, their security will be compromised, because Palestinians are unable to provide security. The second pretext is that Palestinians are unable to govern themselves. Look at the corruption, look at the mismanagement, and by the way, in some quarters, rightly so. And the third excuse is that we have no partner. You all heard that famous phrase. What Salam Fayyad does in his plan is to neutralize these three pretexts totally. Security, he is cooperating with a US general who's sitting right there in the West Bank and Jerusalem and who's overseeing everything. And whether Palestinians like it or not, and I know some of them don't, the security as far as Israel is concerned has never been better compared even with the years of the very direct occupation. So the Palestinian security forces, according to Dayton, whom I heard here at Harvard, I heard many of his speeches online, hails the Palestinian security apparatus as being the best provider for Israel's security. Second, he has cleaned the PA system. Now the PA, as far as financial management, as far as prudent institutions, as far as all the standards, are among one of the best in the region. And thirdly, it would be very hard for Israel to argue that Salam Fayyad is a terrorist. You know, a Texan educated economist working for the World Bank and IMF, usually wearing very nice, attractive yellow ties, and knowing exactly how Americans laugh and make jokes like them, and does that when he meets President Bush. That's the sign of Texas football. Is not somebody who Israel can easily taint as a terrorist. Therefore, his plan, his presence, his campaign, his work, and it's a teamwork. He's not the first one to build institutions, but his idea is enabling Palestinians to proceed on the right direction vis-à-vis international legitimacy. But it needs to include Gaza, for there is no state building without half of its population. It needs to include a national government that is legitimate through the elections, and that is lacking. And it needs the backing of the main political polity of Palestine, and that is lacking. Thank you.
You're listening to Husam Zomlot discussing prospects for a two-state solution in the Middle East. I have some more questions, but I will defer them to the audience. Let's take some questions from the audience. Please come forward and line up at the microphone, and please limit yourself to one well-phrased question without any prefatory comments, if at all possible. Thank you. Then keep it very short, because we have a lot of people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for speaking to us and for presenting the dire reality of what's going on in Palestine. And you've been very clear about that reality of the present situation. And where I'm very disappointed is, on the other hand, you're continuing to push the fantasy somehow that there is a possibility of this two-state solution, and it's all based on Obama riding to the rescue of the Palestinians, and why should we have any faith that Obama would fulfill this campaign promise when he hasn't fulfilled any other campaign promises, from war to civil liberties to the environment. You have the U.S. backing Israel militarily, economically, politically, diplomatically, in every way, shape, or form for many, many, many years, and there is no sign whatsoever that this is going to change. So I think that what you were presenting as the alternative is more realistic, which is going for, that it is an apartheid state. We should acknowledge that. We should say that the only solution is a one-state solution, and that we take that fight to expose apartheid, to win the international community, as you were describing, nonviolence resistance that is growing. It's wonderful to see that and to hear that, and that Palestinians are aware of this reality, and rather than continuing to bring forth unreality, why don't we just accept this is our reality, and how do we fight this situation and become victorious in the vision that you described?
Thank you very much. You've just summarized beautifully, much more eloquently than my lecture. You just summarized my lecture, because I wasn't saying that Obama is about to deliver the two-state solution. I was saying the opposite, and that's why I was fearing that we are moving towards an apartheid situation. That was my argument. However, having said that, a bit of me is still yearning for the two-state solution, because as a Palestinian myself, I want to get away with my own piece of land, for me to build my own nation, and for me to be able at one stage to engage with other nations on different grounds. The battle as we speak now, anti-apartheid, is going to be long and draining, and I hope that it will be bloodless. It certainly will be full of sweat. It won't be sweatless, but I hope it will not be bloodless. A two-state solution, while I approve and I realize that it might no longer be available, would still be, in my opinion, or could have saved us another generation of a struggle.
Thank you very much for your enlightening talk. And I'd just like to ask if you think the United Nations could have a role in Palestine over the next few years.
The UN is all over the conflict, and it already has a role. As you know, UNRWA is the biggest UN agency that provides for Palestinian refugees. And Palestinian refugees, even inside the West Bank and Gaza, in Gaza, they are more than 60% of the population. And UNRWA is almost a government inside government. However, if you mean at the political level, and I know that is exactly what you mean, not service delivery, I thank you for the question, Peter, simply because you are allowing me to say exactly something that I have always believed in. One of the main reasons why the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has not been resolved so far, one of the most protracted conflicts in modern history, is that while the conflict is international and global par excellence, the resolution of it was always left to the two parties to sort on their own. When there is a global issue par excellence, it has to be resolved through global mechanisms. through global, not local, politics, through global institutions. The Palestinians and Israelis, left alone, are incapable to solve it, simply because of the huge, vast asymmetry between the two sides. On the one hand, on the other hand, because there is a lot of vested interest by regional and international players in that conflict, and there is a lot of not only intervention but interference in our midst. And therefore, the UN, in my opinion, is the place where Israel was created to start with. And it is the place where it started the two-state solution in the old formula, the 181 solution, or the 181 resolution, sorry, for that matter. If we mean a resolution to this conflict, and if we mean a resolution to almost every other conflict, and if we really want to have an international system whereby much of this could be resolved without the hassle we have been going through, I think the US and major world power have to empower the United Nations. It is the place, relatively, where things could be done in a different way, when small, narrow vested interests of certain countries could be balanced by overwhelming international values, international standards, international law. And by the way, it will protect everybody. Israel will be mistaken to think that a strong United Nations will be against its presence, unless Israel wants to continue being against every essence of international law.
You mentioned the possibility of increasing nonviolent resistance and mentioned Bil'in as an example. Nonviolent resistance has been mentioned over the decades and has never seemed to me to be very successful. I've never understood what the Palestinians could do very much by way of a successful nonviolent resistance program. Now, do you mean you take Bil'in as an example, 10 Bil'ins or 100 Bil'ins or 500? It takes a great deal of physical courage to do what they do, and the reaction is semi-violent, and it takes a lot of time. How are you going to get tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people to do that?
Thank you, sir. I would cast my vote for nonviolence on two grounds. The first is moral, and the second is tactical. Or the first is strategic, and the second is tactical. On a strategic level, your best bet is to raise the cost of occupation to a level whereby its endurance becomes impossible. How do you do that? Do you do it by engaging only 2 or 3% of your society who could shoot and use arms, or you do it by engaging 100% of your society? No, you do it by engaging 100% of your society. The women and the elderly, the young and the old, everybody, like the first Intifada. You send the Israeli well-trained army into alleyways chasing kids. And you send tens of thousands of these soldiers to try and curb a mass movement. On a tactical level, if you want to not bite, even though Tyson does bite actually, but if you want to beat Tyson, you don't invite him to the boxing board. He'll beat the hell out of you. If you really want to defeat Tyson, take him to the chessboard. Take him somewhere else. Don't invite Israel's might. The Palestinians are a nation who have been, throughout the years, largely civilian, largely captive. And to expect from them to put up with the viciousness of the Israeli army is unfair. However, if Palestinians, through their several mechanisms, arms, not arms as in violent arms, but international arms, like the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, like the Goldstone Report, like several international organs, could really end like Salam Fayyad and what he's doing, and with the Bil'in mushrooming phenomena, could bring Israel to a point where it starts feeling the cost of its occupation, then I think popular resistance will deliver much more. On the other hand, the cost of occupation is met by a net profit. You need to know, sir, that Israel is there not only for ideological or political reasons. Controlling a land as vast as the West Bank that has most of the water aquifers of the entire Palestine, with one of the most fertile land in the Jordan Valley and around Jenin, does not come free, nor it is with no profit. It's extremely profitable. I am an economist, but I have no formula to calculate how much profit Israel is making on even a daily basis from the use of Palestinian land, water, resources, cheap labor, name it. I know that only in the Jordan Valley area, Israel has invested $5 billion in the last 5 years, only in the Majul. Majul is the date, the very special Israeli, Palestinian, you name it, occupied Palestinian date. To Europe and America. This is a very profitable business. And I'm bringing the profit to the coast to say that also a popular resistance would enable Palestinians to resist dealing economically with the occupation via boycotting settlers and the settlement products, etc. And lastly, through our experience of the First Intifada, we have learned that peaceful and non-violence demonstrations unite us Palestinians. And it produced the best in us. It brings the best in us. Throughout the first years of the First Intifada in 1987, there was a united leadership in Palestine. And it used to take one leaflet for the entire Palestinian people to follow. Legitimacy was driven from the popular resistance, from the power of the people. We would want to emulate and repeat that. And I think it is happening because Palestinians, as I said earlier, have learned it and learned it the hard way.
My sense is that the Israeli government, the Israeli prime minister, historically, has been more interested in self-preservation in office than in any long-term strategic benefits. How do you see Obama, with any and all of the tools at his disposal, being able to convert the current or even any future Israeli government to move toward the two-state solution?
That's a question that needs much more thinking, but I'll offer you my very tentative thinking. Almost every single US president since 1967 has vehemently opposed Israeli settlements. Not almost, in fact, every one of them. Everyone. There were 2 points in history when 2 presidents took action, showed teeth. The first was George Bush Sr. in 1991 or 2, was it, Herb? 1991, when he actually threatened to withhold the Israeli aid or aid to Israel from the US. And the second one is Obama, when he started first day demanding full freeze of Israeli settlement. The first is history, and we know he didn't succeed. Shamir went back. There was a period of 6 months of Israeli freeze of settlements during the Bush senior years, when Shamir went back to settlement, mushrooming actually at that time, not only expansion. And now, even President Obama is not even getting that 6 months. He's not getting nothing. I went on to say the reasons. But also the US presidents have a lot at display, have a lot to use. For instance, it was Bill Clinton, in my opinion, who has provided some sort of an inducive environment for the toppling of the very same Benjamin Netanyahu in 1997. What I'm trying to say is, for the Israeli society, anything is discussed, anything is possible except one thing: this existential relationship with the US. This, for many Israelis, if not all of them, is a red line. And by the way, according to my reading of opinion polls in Israel, Obama's approval rate in Israel something that I don't like to use actually, because I've been hearing many Americans saying, oh, Obama's approving rate in Israel is declining, so what? He's not elected by the Israelis nor the Palestinians for that matter. He's elected by the US, the American people. But nonetheless, his approving in Israel have been increasing. Why? Because no Israeli would want to see a serious tension to an extent of a break in the relationship between Israel and the US, and Netanyahu represents a threat to that existential relationship. And it was almost the very same dynamic that drove Netanyahu out in 1997, who came on a ticket of anti-Oslo, by the way, the very same. I read, and I'm sure some of you read, an article by David Miller a couple of weeks ago. The title of the article was Regime Change. David Miller was a very senior US State Department official who has been President Bill Clinton's main sort of advisor vis-a-vis the Middle East peace process. A very refined man and a very well-known man in the business of peacemaking. Wrote an article, Regime Change, and by this he didn't mean any Arab regime change or any regime change in a Muslim country, but in Israel itself. In it, he argued that for Obama to move forward, he has to effectively topple Netanyahu yet again. I think given the dynamics, given how significant the US to Israelis, and given how the very narrow coalition, strong, vicious, I think toppling Netanyahu is not impossible. But here is the question. Will toppling Netanyahu bring the two-state solution into reality? No. Because his successor will be Livni, most likely. And we know what Livni had to offer. And his predecessor, Olmert, who's now saying that Israel is going to be finished if the two-state solution is not realized, has done nothing during his time of office. No, this is not just about, in my opinion, this isn't just about, sir, an Israeli political system that is narrow, and it is narrow. Nor it is just about prime ministers and cabinet members who want to protect themselves and their narrow interests and their survival and preserve their positions. There is a lot of that. But this is about the lot of the Israeli society, who I believe has not yet reached the conclusion that there must be a two-state in that region. I don't think that the majority of Israelis believe that Palestinians have the right, legitimate right, for a state of their own. The majority of them would want to see the Palestinians far away, segregated, separated, unseen, untouched, unheard of, and create whatever you want. The closest to them was Rabin, the most moderate, and Rabin said, I would want to see a Palestinian state minus. So it was never a Palestinian state. Palestinians have gone through a journey, a very long journey from the 80s, and from the 60s to the 80s until that declaration, of self-searching, of talking, of dialoguing, of actually confronting and fighting and killing, not Israelis, but one another, to reach that point when they declared an initiative of the two-state solution and the West Bank and Gaza. That journey, that very bloody journey, that very tiring journey, did not happen in Israel. We do not know as we stand today, what is it that Israel in its collective entity wants? What are the borders that Israelis seek? What is it when we are asked to approve or to recognize Israel? What borders are we talking about? We are yet to see a serious leader in Israel who would usher his nation into this very fascinating journey of reaching a point when they will collectively offer a plan that yet does not exist. Thank you.
Yes, your talk gave me a great deal of hope, and I hope that your vision of a strategy of the moral high ground is indeed taking place and will grow, because I see this having a very powerful positive effect on movements in Israel and in the United States. I have in mind, in particular, the movement Breaking the Silence of young soldiers in the Israeli army who are revealing the complete moral breakdown of this army. And in the United States, I'm thinking of J Street. J Street is recent, but in the few years that it has started to lobby, it has made extremely fast progress. And finally, we see a countervailing force to AIPAC, and it's growing very quickly. And I hope I'm not deluding myself, but listening to you gives me hope that if this is indeed the way Palestine is going, it's going to strengthen these forces, both in the US and in Israel. And Breaking the Silence is the one I chose because I found it extremely telling. And J Street is not a minor phenomenon at all. I would like to know your opinion on this.
Well, you also gave me hope with your hope. Thank you for the question. You see, you reminded me of something to add why nonviolence is of paramount to the Palestinians right now. Because it also engages and includes as partners growing segments of the Israeli society as part and parcel of that nonviolent movement. In fact, in Bil'in, I really saw young Israelis running around and organizing an international conference, inviting all these speakers, speaking Hebrew in Bil'in. And I learned that the municipality of Bil'in rented a flat for them because the Israeli authorities would always lay siege on Bil'in every Friday, preventing the Israelis to come. So what these Israelis are doing now, they come Thursday, they sleep over, they stay Friday, and then they leave Saturday morning when the army leaves. So nonviolence brings also an increasing segments of the Israeli society. And I believe that without that, there is no hope. In the end, whatever method, whatever technique you employ to attain your rights have to speak to an increasing constituency in the other side. If you don't, then you are doomed to fail. It's as simple as that. As for the J Street, I agree with you. This is a very important phenomenon. And I quoted Professor John Mershemer, and I was reading an article of his or a speech of his. And while I might not agree with every single thing he says, I really found what he says in this part very interesting. That if the conflict evolves into a greater Israel, then the ones who would really be leading the fight are the Jewish community in the US. And in his opinion, there are three different sort of categories within the Jewish community. In his opinion, there are the righteous Jews, there are the benevolent, silent majority, and there are the new Africans, according to him, at the very right side of things. To him, he thinks that the righteous Jews will be making the argument against the situation in Israel-Palestine, calling for a unitary situation. To him, and to me, I think, Jews will not tolerate, while they might not be able to speak against military occupation, issues of land and liberation, they will not tolerate the oppression of or the lack of human rights, civil rights, political rights, discrimination, racism, etc. And in his opinion, the benevolent majority in the middle will move and tilt towards the righteous Jews. And increasingly, it will be that community who would be the main voice for a change. While that may be very, very optimistic, I think it has some of the truth in that without engaging particular segments within the Jewish community in this country, also Palestinians and their quest for international legitimacy will be incomplete. And the J Street is a very significant development, an important change that Palestinians not only have to understand and study, but speak to and in fact engage with. Sir.
In some ways, I wish I had come up earlier. I don't want to be a downer after all that. And I have marched with here and in Palestine some of the groups you're talking about. I think J Street is doing something very important. I think that analysis of the Jewish community here is right on. My fear is that it's precisely the holding on to the two-state solution that you talk about, that J Street talks about, is what's going to do the Palestinians in. And what I mean by that is, I mean, first of all, I've been over there a number of times for months, and I don't see how you can carve a state in any way unless something that I can't possibly imagine happens in terms of some of the things you've talked about within the Israeli government and the Israeli people. But my question goes to a combination of really Sarah Roy's initial question and something that you said in your presentation about that expulsion is not viable. And I think the reality is that that's what a certain segment, certainly of the leadership in Israel, is counting. No, they're not going to expel, there's not going to be a law to expel the Palestinians. But I think the whole idea of occupation that we've seen for decades is the destruction of any viable way, number one, of state building. Every time there is the pretext of going in on any kind of military or police action, computers are destroyed, buildings are destroyed, the infrastructure is destroyed, and the economy is such that only those people who can afford to or have some way of getting out are leaving. And I think that what the Israelis are counting on is that over time there will be this natural kind of unspoken expulsion. There won't be anything for the righteous or that middle group of American Jews to stand up and scream about, which we should be doing. We will look back at some point and say, boy, we should have taken all of these opportunities for a two-state solution. Isn't it too bad? And maybe we can carve out some reservations with the Native Americans to put the Palestinians in so they don't feel so bad. I'm being ridiculously facetious, but it seems to me that's kind of where we're headed, and that's where the Netanyahus are banking on. And if you had people in other governments like Lieberman, the people in power in this country wouldn't talk to them. And we're not standing up and saying, you know, you can't keep going in that direction.
Thank you for the question. So if I understood it correctly, you mean that we shouldn't let go of the two-state solution. That was the main, Sarah, that was the main idea. And that expulsion is really a reality. You know, I went to Palestine with my brother, Muhammad, his name is. And Muhammad has received a very interesting offer by an international hotel, Movenpick, a German hotel only in the Middle East, to manage the hotel. My brother has been in London, living in London for several years. He was educated there. He is specialized in hotel management. And he was managing a branch of the Hilton hotels in London. And of course, because of his expertise, he was recruited by the Ramallah Movenpick. Upon his arrival, and he signed the contract, etc. Upon his arrival, the manager of the hotel told him that, oops, my friend, I'm sorry, we cannot honor the contract simply because the Israeli authorities have just issued a new military order that would prevent anybody who does not have a permit, a Palestinian who does not have a permit, from living in Ramallah. Now, my brother happened to have his original address registered in Gaza. What I'm trying to say, and then my brother is going to leave soon Palestine almost with a one-way ticket. Yes, indeed, what you are saying is true. And I have just experienced it with a member of my own family who was unable to live in his own country, to work in his own country, waiting for a permit from an 18-year-old boy sitting in Beit El. Of course, expulsion is happening, and it's happening slowly, and we see it. In 2006 alone, there was 50,000 Palestinians who left the West Bank with a one-way ticket. It is a real danger. But what to do about it? There are two ways. Either we go for the grand strategy, either a grand war like the 48 and the 67, or a grand bargain, Oslo, Camp David's. I don't know if it comes with age, Sarah, but I am no longer a believer of the grande things. I'm slowly shifting towards incrementalism. The people of Palestine would always and also need any small little thing to help them preserve on their land. The building of a road in a small village will help. The ensuring of that this farm will export even 10% of its flour production will help. So Palestinians cannot just sit and wait for a political breakthrough to happen. And the small little incremental things should not and must not be seen as contradictory to their bigger struggle against Israel or against occupation. It shouldn't. And in fact, the moment that Palestinians start adopting incrementalism and start realizing that it's a chip process is an empowering moment. Because then they see value in every little step as they go down the alley. And they accumulate a brick over another. And I'm saying all this to say that there is no easy answer for all this. There isn't, sir, there isn't. Every single way has been tried. Non-violence in the first Intifada, armed struggle during the Fatah and the national movement in the 60s, the peace process of the 90s and the Oslo. I mean, the Palestine national movement has turned its sons and daughters into protectors of Israel during the Oslo. I mean, all these names that you see now, the Dahalan and all these people who have formed security apparatuses were actually founders of the national movement. It turns its own members into part and parcel of the system of the protection of Israel. All this was an attempt to reach some sort of a solution. It didn't. And the second Intifada, which was the worst that the Palestinians have experienced in terms of the violence and their actions and the destruction brought by it. Nothing worked. Nothing worked because there are so many factors, but I believe if you want to apply rational and political science on the Israeli society, you would go wrong. This is a very particular society, that its mosaic, its composition, its background, its psychology, its politics, its economics, its relationship to the world, its internal, its external, its regional, name it, is so distinct to an extent that normal things do not just lead to normal reactions. The entire Israeli society now believes that it's the wall that protects them from suicide bombings. For God's sake, if somebody wants to kill him or herself, do you think a wall would block him or her from doing that? It wouldn't. And by the way, the wall is not complete. It's not, so anybody can actually just go around it and go and do whatever he or she would want to. It's a society that needs care, and it's a society that also required to think incrementally. How do we sometimes speak to their insecurities and grievances, not to aggravate it, and other times how to press where it hurts. And I think where it hurts most is morally. Jews cannot handle moral pressure. They can handle political pressure. They can handle economic pressure. Oh, they're good at handling economic pressure. I see her laughing, but they cannot handle moral pressure. Ma'am.
You mentioned the United Nations and possible things that they could do, and the Goldstone report. And even if it ends up getting buried and going nowhere, what can we do with this report as a tool? 'Cause I think it's an extraordinary document and could be used somehow.
You know, the Goldstone, and before the Goldstone, the International Court of Justice ruling, which in my opinion, one of the most important international legal document vis-a-vis the conflict, which ruled against the wall, but not only the wall, it ruled against settlements and against the occupation itself, are the most non-violent acts. What could be more non-violent than the use of international organs? What could be more non-violent? But look at the sheer resistance Look at the vicious attacks, not only at the UN, which is blamed by Israel to be a hotbed for terrorists. Peter, you might be happy to know, the friends of UN in the room. But actually, the man himself, Goldstone, and you may have been following how viciously he has been attacked, not only professionally, but personally, to the extent of his own Mar B'Tzeva sort of celebration in South Africa. And I was reading the story the other day. But he spoke. He stood up in South Africa. He went to the synagogue. He said what he believed in, and he was applauded. I think the report I read, and I'm not certain that it's very accurate, but the report I read is that he was heard. Again, this brings me to the question before. This is not the Africans of South Africa. You know, my friend, and we have enough Jewish community in this group to agree or disagree with me. Nor this is the Protestants of Northern Ireland. This is a situation whereby Jews have really been suffering the misgivings of history. Frankly, not at the hands of Palestinians, nor at the hands of Muslims for that matter. We have absolutely, I raise my hands in innocence. We have nothing to do with it. But they have suffered nonetheless. At the hands of tyranny, of racism, of Nazism, and we all know what happened. But before that, they also have come to realize that in wherever they go, there is a certain level of anti-Semitism, even before the Second World War. For that society, living by the sword is something that will not be given up easily. And living by the sword is not physical, or just living by the sword, but being always awakened, being always ready, being always organized, being always almost vicious if anything comes your way. I don't know how to handle this. I don't know if Palestinians are capable of resolving one of the most vicious stories of the human history that they have nothing to do with to start with. I don't know if Palestinians are capable of answering the insecurities of generations and of millennia. I don't know if Palestinians have even the ability to provide the security Israel needs. And that's why it is not going to be Palestinians and Israelis who will answer that. It must be global. We are too little as two nations. We are too small. We are too insignificant to resolve this very significant conflict. President Obama has been repeating, so is his Secretary of State Clinton, so is his Chief of Staff and the head of the General Petraeus. All have been repeating that the conflict is spilling over. It is endangering the lives of American boys. These are soldiers they mean. They keep repeating lately that resolving the conflict is in the strategic interest of the United States of America, yet they are unable to do nothing about it. This is very strange. The sole superpower, the United States of America, is unable to resolve a conflict that it deems against its very strategic interest. It needs forces beyond governments. It needs forces beyond interest and narrow groups. It needs a universal movement that will use every single venue possible, not to punish, nor to blame, nor to shame, but to shout and keep shouting that the current status quo is not sustainable. For every Israeli, it is almost a belief that it is sustainable. They could live on like this for a long time. But I think it is starting to happen in London, in New York, in Cambridge, in so many places that these very small forces are starting together. I don't think Palestinians have not been able to put up the fight. They have put a hell of a fight. But their inability to deliver a blow to their oppressor and the occupation is due to the fact that the forces against them are beyond the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that's why I believe that an event like today, and the many events that I have been attending in Cambridge, in the US, the discussion, the debate, the writing of letters, the taking action against the many things, and I have been following some of your activities here, the justice groups, the NGOs, the going to Palestine and Israel, and taking part in the nonviolent mass movements, name it, is going to be the beginning, but I think it's the only alternative. Thank you.